Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So today what we're going to be covering is my Ice Staff Tank Nightblade build, but before we do get into that I want to briefly say that I have made some changes to how this build video is structured in comparison to my previous videos, so please do let me know how you find it. Any feedback would be great as to whether perhaps you find it more engaging or useful, so that I can actually get into a habit of perhaps keeping this the standard for my videos moving forward. Anyways, without dispense to, let's get into the build. So for those of us who perhaps missed the changes to Ice Staffs, basically with the Homestead update they were altered so as to enable them to be used as an alternative tanking weapon choice. Now this change actually received a lot of controversy, many people believing it was relatively pointless and offered no real benefit to tanking. Now I actually was quite positive with this change in that I saw some benefits to be gained for non-DK tanks in particular, and this is because the Ice Staff tanking toolset allows us to have better ad control, which, if you know anything about DKs, will quickly become quite irrelevant as DKs have great ad control already. Now Choking Talons is the ability I'm particularly talking about in this case, and this enables us, once enemies are stacked, to immobilize them in place and also debuff them with minor maim, reducing their damage done to the group. Now Ice Staffs can also be used in a similar fashion, and for non-DK tanks who really had nothing comparable to Choking Talons, this is a really nice change as it enables us to more easily control ad fights and stack enemies more efficiently and also keep them stacked, which in turn I think makes the tanks a little bit closer in terms of how useful they are in at least 4-man content. So now that we're all up to date with the changes, let's get into the first part of the build proper, which is the sets. And the first set I want to focus on is the Werewolf Hide set. Now we're primarily using this because of the 5-piece bonus, which enables us to have higher ultimate regeneration, which as we'll see is quite important for this build's success. Now you might be thinking to yourself, one ultimate a second isn't that strong, right? But when we compare it to things like Heroic Slash, which grant minor heroism, it's actually more ultimate gained over the same time period than minor heroism, so it's stronger than you might think on face value. In addition, the 2- and 3-piece bonuses are actually quite decent, more health allowing us to take bigger hits, and also enabling the healers to get a little bit more time to react, meaning we won't die so frequently if our heals are a little bit slow. In addition to that, the extra stamina also enables us to block for longer while we're on our sword and board bar, and allows us to cast more stamina-based abilities. However, it's worth keeping in mind that the 4-piece is relatively useless, but you can't have it all I suppose, and the benefits of the 5-piece certainly outweigh the kind of minor negative of having a 4-piece bonus which isn't too substantial. In terms of which pieces of Werewolf Hide want to be running, you first either want to be running a Werewolf Hide belt or Werewolf Hide gloves, as these 2 slots here are the least armor slots, and since Werewolf Hide is medium armor, this means that we're going to be minimizing the amount of armor lost by running some medium armor in our armor slots. Now, in terms of where else we're going to get a Werewolf Hide, we want to be running 3 Werewolf Hide jewelry pieces and 1 Werewolf Hide shield. Now, in terms of getting this, you can either buy it from a guild trader as it is bind on equip, and this means that you can save yourself some time, but if you are interested in how to farm it, I'm going to tell you guys how to go about doing it. Now, first off, I will say that this means that ideally you want to try and get yourself some Werewolf Hide gloves, as it makes farming it a little bit more time efficient. So, if you do want to farm it, first off, we can get our jewelry by going to Dolmen's in Glenumbra, which is located here, here, and up here. Now, when you complete your Dolmen's, you're going to get a chest that spawns at the end of it, and this is guaranteed to drop you a jewelry piece. However, keep in mind that there are 3 sets that drop in this zone, meaning that it's a little bit less likely to get Werewolf Hide every time, but you'll actually farm it relatively fast, and while purple may take a little bit more, it means that you can get yourself some Werewolf Hide quite quickly. In order to get the gloves and the shield, we're going to have to go somewhere else though, namely to the public dungeon, which is Badman's Hollow in Glenumbra. Once inside, all we have to do is kill the public dungeon bosses, and each have a chance to drop either the gloves or a weapon piece of which a shield is counted as, meaning that it can be a quite quick process if you are lucky. However, keep in mind there is kind of a cap over a certain time period where you can get drops, meaning that once you've killed enough bosses, you won't get any more drops for a certain time period until it resets, so don't be worried if you stop getting drops. On the bright side though, this is quite close to the Daggerfall Covenant hub, meaning you can sell items quite quickly and get back to grinding. In terms of the traits that you want for your Werewolf Hide drop pieces, you can't change jewelry, so it's always going to be robust, but for a shield, ideally try and get reinforced, as it does increase the armor value and pairs well with CP passives, which I'll talk about a bit later. And for our Werewolf Hide belt or gloves, we want sturdy, and sturdy is a choice for all of our armor pieces moving forward. The next set we'll be using is Akaviri Dragonguard, and this set is great because the 2 to 4-piece bonuses are all quite relevant and useful for us, especially when we're on our sword and board bar. In addition to that, the 5-piece bonus is excellent as it enables us to pump out more ultimates, which pairs well with Werewolf Hide because we're trying to get lots of ultimate regen, while also reducing the cost of our ultimates, meaning we can now use our ultimates more liberally. The Akaviri Dragonguard pieces we want to ideally be using if we can get them to drop are going to be the chest piece, the legs, and the feet, in conjunction with an Akaviri Dragonguard belt if you can, as this will save you some time farming, though if you are buying it, as I said, feel free to either use it in one of these positions interchangeably. You also want to be running Akaviri Dragonguard weapons, namely a one-handed weapon on your front bar sword and board, and a two-handed ice staff on your back bar. Now, since some of these are a little bit obscure, particularly the charged ice staff, you may find difficulty buying this, meaning that you might actually have to farm it, so I will go ahead and let you guys know how to farm it efficiently in a little bit. However, one thing I will say is, and I want to bring a highlight to, is you'll notice that when we swap to our ice staff bar like right now, you'll see that our 5-piece is not active on our Werewolf Hide. And the benefit of this is, and some people have sort of highlighted this as an issue of ice staffs, we can't get a 5-piece, 5-piece, and 2-piece active at the same time. However, as you see here, it says when we take damage, you generate 5 ultimate, and it has a 5-second cooldown. This means that when we take damage, we see that our ultimate starts to go up. We can now swap bars, and as long as we swap back within 5 seconds to reapply it, or within a fair amount of time, maybe you can go 7 seconds, for example, you won't miss out on too much ultimate. It means that effectively we're not losing out anything by having us drop down to a 4-piece when we're on our back bar, which is a really nice way of getting around the kind of constraint of having to use an ice staff, that takes up 2 slots in our back bar, and means that, well, we can have an efficient build, and it means also that the ice staff change really doesn't impact this build negatively whatsoever. So worth keeping in mind, though it does obviously necessitate a little bit more bar swapping, especially if you want to try and generate as much ultimate as theoretically possible. With that said, let's get into looking about how to efficiently farm these. Now, in order to get our large pieces, namely our chest piece and our leg piece, we want to actually be going to overland bosses in Eastmarch. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any overland boss locations marked on this character, but basically what you want to look out for is a big skull and crossbones on your map, and when you go there, there'll be a very sort of high health boss, which actually might require you to get some friends to help kill. This means it's not so much solo friendly, so it can be an issue. In addition to that, the boss also has a chance of dropping a weapon piece, so you could get your Akaviri weapons on top of that. Now, in order to get our belt and our feet, if we decide to go that way, we can get both of these in one location, namely by going to a public dungeon, and just to briefly show you a location of one, somehow I managed to hit 3 sky shards without hitting one. For example, here, where it says Delve, if you have this add-on, you can go to the Delves here and kill the end boss at the end of the dungeon and get yourself, well, hopefully get yourself an Akaviri Dragonguard piece. Though keep in mind you'll have to go between dungeons to get this effectively, or simply wait, I guess semi-AFK, for the boss to respawn before killing it again. Now, if you didn't manage to get a weapon piece from the overland bosses, and they are kind of difficult to kill, I recommend then going back to the public dungeon to get a weapon piece, and it's located here in Eastmarch. I haven't been there yet, but take my word for it, it is located here. And it's easier because overland bosses are a lot harder to kill solo than it is to kill a public dungeon boss, which has quite significantly less health. Anyways, once again in terms of traits, we want sturdy here. And for our weapons, we want defending on our front bar, which makes us more tanky when we're tanking, main bosses, which is what we'll be using predominantly for tanking main bosses, is our sword and board bar. And for trash fights, we want charged, which is to try and maximize the amount of time we're applying that shield debuff, which got changed, which is going to be applying minor maim and also interacting with a few other abilities to snare and root enemies in place, which we'll get into in a little bit. The final sets to discuss are the 2-piece monster helms, and in this build we're going to be using 2 interchangeably dependent on the environment. So the first one we're using is Swarm Mothers, and this is really nice because for non-DK tanks we don't have access to change to stack adds. So when we are fighting adds in trash fights, for example, we'll use this set, which allows us to drag enemies in, stack them tightly, and allow our DPS to AoE them down efficiently. However, if we're not in a trash fight, if we're fighting a single target boss, we want to swap out that set and use Bloodspawn. Now, Bloodspawn is great because not only does it provide us with some extra resistances, which can be essential in sort of, more damaging boss fight environments, but the ultimate regeneration also allows us to efficiently generate Warhorns more consistently, which is important for this build as our stat line is kind of dependent on it. As you see here, we are using a light shoulder and a heavy helmet, and you want to make sure, because we're using it interchangeably, that they're the same armor type as our Swarm Mothers, so in this case light and heavy, otherwise you're going to mess up and miss out on some bonuses, so do keep that in mind. Before we get into discussion regarding enchants, attributes, and a few other passes which I want to highlight before moving on to the skill discussion, I want to also just give you a visual kind of demonstration of the way that Swarm Mothers works, and also provide you with some information regarding things to look out for, some techniques you can try, because it is worth keeping in mind that the way this works is a little bit different and a bit more, I guess, complex, or I would say you have to pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing with this than you would with chains, as it works quite differently. Anyways, if you're not familiar, as you saw just then, I moused over the tooltip. Basically, if you're blocking and the enemy's more than 5 meters away and they hit you, they're going to get dragged in, as you saw just in that ranged ad. Now, if we're staying right here, standing still, as you can see, nothing's really happening. It's not proccing, as 5 meters is not quite fulfilled there, but if we move away, you'll see here, and that is a bug right there. I don't know what happened there, something weird. But that archer that just hit us then should have been dragged in, and you'll see once he hits again, he'll get dragged in. Also keep in mind that they do get CC immune for a little bit after getting dragged in, so you can't perma do it. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we are repositioning, like right now, if a melee ad does channel an attack, this can mean that it'll actually use the proc of your chain, so to speak, which then takes it into a 2-second cooldown. This can result in archers not getting stacked very quickly like right now, and sometimes if you don't get it timed well, they'll start doing a channel like then, and not all channels will actually drag the archer to you if it does hit you, which can necessitate you actually interrupting them sometimes. This means that when we do reposition or are required to reposition the stack, it's a good idea just to drop block, move away, as you saw me doing right now, sort of dropping block, moving, before activating block once again in order to get enemies back here, which means that we can kind of prevent the melee ads hitting us accidentally and using the proc, which in turn means that we're stacking our ranged ads much more efficiently. Overall then, pretty much to sum this up, is basically you have to pay a little more attention to your movement, to how you're blocking when you are fighting trash pools, and it's certainly a bit more involved in terms of what you have to do when compared to chains. And here I just died to reset the trash pool, as I did have a few more clips I wanted to film on this particular trash. Anyways guys, let's move on. Alright, so with a little bit of change of scenery, back to Shadowfen now. I just want to touch on a few extra little passives that you keep in mind that can be useful for thinking about this build, in addition to also covering the enchants and the attributes and kind of the stat layout that you want to be aiming for before getting into the skill discussion. So in terms of our stat lines, you'll see here that we're going with a health line which is a little bit less than what I normally recommend at the 30k mark, and the reason we're doing this and the reason the stats are laid out as they are is that we're trying to complement the stat line with aggressive horn. So if we just pop that now, we'll see that our health is sitting above the 30k mark, which is ideal, and is actually a little bit too much, but you'll see why that is the case, as I do need to reallocate some attributes. But basically what we want to be doing here is trying to maximize your maximum Magicka once you do hit that 30k mark HP wise with Warhorn up. So that probably means getting around about 28k HP without Warhorn, and then sort of going from there. In terms of stamina, you don't want to touch this, and the reason behind that is quite simple, primarily because our rings that we're using provide only command robust, which in turn means that we already have a very high stamina pool, as this build, skill-wise, uses predominantly Magicka-based abilities, and will require a lot of Magicka to successfully block on our Ice Staff, which we'll get into a little bit. This means that in terms of enchanting, if you are rich, and feel free to actually use Tri-Stat enchants on all of your armor, though keep in mind if you do that, you may want to use Infused on the armor pieces such as your chest, which provide the largest sort of enchantment stat bonus. Now, if you don't have access to those kind of funds, feel free to just allocate points into health and Magicka respectively until you do get to that kind of 30k HP with Warhorn up stat line, and then just put the rest into max Magicka. In a similar vein, if we look at our attributes, you pretty much just want to put them all into max Magicka. This means that we're going to, I ideally want to be taking these out of health, but I haven't got around to it yet, so try and dump as many points into Magicka as you can once you've hit that kind of 30k with Warhorn health benchmark. With respect to our jewelry, we want to be using shield play on all of our jewelry pieces. Now the reason behind this, and why I don't actually have any Magicka recovery as I usually do my other builds, is because since we are blocking with two different resource types, you know, we're going to be blocking with stamina when we're using our sword on board, and Magicka when we use our ice staff. This means that you get a little bit more value out of this, and is especially relevant on our Magicka bar when we're using our ice staff, as, you know, since we're using a lot of Magicka abilities, this can go down quite quickly unless we're trying to use as much as we can to try and mitigate the amount of sort of cost it takes for us to block while using our ice staff. So yeah, once again, use these are really solid as well, because there's no diminishing returns with this. They're additive, so it means that you're getting the full value out of each of these shield play enchantments with respect to reducing the amount of, you know, cost it takes for you to block. Really solid, so yeah, no real other benefit to any other option I can see at this point in time, so I really do encourage you getting these. In terms of our weapons, for our front bar, so for our sword and board, on our axe we want to be using, or any one-handed, we want to be using the Crusher enchantment, primarily because it reduces the resistances of any boss we're fighting or enemy, which means that DPS can do more damage. Pretty simple really. In terms of the enchantment best suited for ice staves, I like to use a Absorb Magicka enchant, just to allow us to sustain our Magicka a little bit better, but to be honest there's much more room here for preference. You could go with an alternative option such as if you want a bit more stamina, or even any other type of damage type, perhaps you want to debuff an enemy or just do a little bit of extra damage. No real best option here though, I would personally recommend going with something that does sustain your resources, be that Magicka or stamina. There are also a few other passes which I want to touch on which are really important for this build. So as you may have already picked up on, but I will just kind of point it out here very obviously, we're using 1 light piece, 5 heavy pieces, and 1 medium piece. Now the reason we're doing this 5-1-1 setup is to first off take advantage of the 5-piece benefits that we get with our heavy armor passes, which are both really strong, but I don't want to dwell on them too much. You can have a look in your own time as I don't want to spend too much. And likewise, because we're using 1 piece light, 1 piece medium, we're also going to be taking advantage of some of these passives here, and some of these passives here, which in turn just add minor benefits, extra recovery, some cost reduction, things like that, which can help out our tank. However, probably the main reason that we're doing the 1-1 and 5 heavy armor is primarily because if we look at our guild and go to Undaunted, we're going to be getting Undaunted Metal at the maximum, which is 6%, and this is 6% extra stats, which scales really well for tanking, as max stats just means, being a little bit tankier, be able to have a bit more buffer, and also allows you to have higher Magicka and stamina pools, which means that blocking is a little bit easier. You can block for longer, which in turn helps you with resource maintenance and also allows you to cast more abilities while actually blocking at the same time. In terms of leveling this up, you can pretty much just go as it says here. It's very simple. Completing dungeon achievements or pledges is the best way to do this. And in terms of pledges, the pickup location for that is in the second zone. So after your starting kind of zone, Glenumbra, for example, and Daggerfall, you go to Stormhaven, and in the main city there, you can pick up your pledges and do those. Though keep in mind, this is something that you can kind of do a little bit later on when you hit, level 50 for normal at least, and then when you want to get to 160 CP, you can go ahead and try the vet pledges. I wouldn't recommend doing it beforehand, as veteran pledges can be a little bit difficult, especially when under geared. Though if you do have some friends who are high DPS, they can certainly probably help you through as a tank a bit easier than perhaps if you were just a DPS starting off. Anyways, there's also one last passive I want to talk about, and it is in the Alchemy line and its medicinal use. So basically this is going to have the resulting effects of our potions last by 30%, and what this pretty much means is it means if a potion gives us Magicka recovery, let's just say 20% major intellect, for a certain amount of time, it's going to increase that by 30%, which in turn means that our pots go a lot further and allows us to sustain our resources better, and is especially relevant on non-DK tanks because our resource management isn't quite as strong as that tank. So it's worth keeping in mind that you want to level up your alchemy just to get medicinal use. Moving on to the skill discussion now, the first bar I want to talk about is the sword and board bar, which will be our front bar. Now the reason I call it the front bar is that because it's primarily the bar we're going to be using when we're tanking single target bosses, or bosses with a few adds, doesn't really matter, you get the idea, wherever we're tanking boss content and not fighting trash packs. Keep in mind though, obviously, that we will swap to our front bar occasionally to apply certain buffs, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So the first ability that we're using is Pierce Armour, and in a similar vein to Crusher enchant, it's great because it reduces the resistances of the boss we're fighting, which means that boss takes more damage, which in turn means it dies faster, things go more smoothly. In addition, it also essentially taunts the enemy to you, which is definitely a requisite of tanking. You can't really tank without a taunt. Not much more to say about that. Moving now on to the next ability, which is a bit more interesting. Refreshing Path is great because it provides a little bit of extra damage, but also is going to allow our movement speed to be increased, allowing us to perhaps dodge some conal attacks, alongside also healing any allies that step on it. This is also quite nice because it allows us to support our team, while also, doing a little bit of extra damage. In addition to that, Nightblades don't have a stereotypical kind of defensive buff kind of ability. They don't have like a 20-second ability that they pop to get their major defensive buffs. Instead, they can cast something in a shadow line, as you see here. And this is because of the Shadow Barrier passive. Basically, when you cast any ability here, it's going to give us Major Ward and Major Resolve, increasing our resistances. And this bonus, it's initially 4 seconds, but it's increased by 125%, which is just for 5 armor pieces. Now, unfortunately, Strendar is a little bit problematic at the moment, so we can't actually see the Refreshing Path duration. But as you see there, the Major Resolve at the bottom left lasts for about 8 seconds, so you have to try and cast that as much as possible every 8 seconds to ensure you're not taking too much damage. The next ability on our line is Swallow Soul, and this is excellent primarily because it allows us to get a nice strong sort of heal over time effect, in addition to providing some extra damage, which means the boss might die a little bit faster, especially in easier content. It also allows us to get Minor Vitality buff, which is extra 8% healing, which makes us a lot more tanky in a sense, and allows our healers to have an easier job, and makes our heals go a little bit further than they might otherwise do. So it's overall good for yourself because we already have self heals as well coming in, which benefits from this, and also good for our healer. In addition to that, Casting this ability every 4 seconds is going to activate the transfer passive, which means we're getting more ultimate. So it's important to try and cast this in a rotation every 4 seconds. In a similar vein to it's important to cast this every 8 seconds to keep our major defensive buff up. Our next ability in the line is Heroic Slash. Now this is excellent because it provides minor maim to the enemy, and you might be thinking it's a bit weird to include an Ice Staff build since Ice Staffs do provide minor maim through their chilled passive, but basically this is a way of reliably doing it in a single target environment where the proc chance of chilled isn't high enough or might not get applied to certain bosses. Also, it's nice because it gives us minor heroism, which is a strong ultimate regeneration tool, and as you see, it's one ultimate every 1.5 seconds, so just to quickly look back at it, that is less than what we're getting from our werewolf, which is one ultimate every 1 second. In addition to that, it also snares the enemy, not really relevant too much in boss fights as most bosses are immune to snares, but can be used in certain situations to just kind of limit the movement of certain enemies which might otherwise, I don't know, you don't want them hitting you for example and you're trying to kite them, though it's a very fringe situation. Also the fact this is his stamina is quite good as we will have more stamina because of the werewolf hide, so we can actually use this a bit more liberally than if we had a lesser stamina pool. And as I said, it's always a really strong ability to use and is one that I use on my DK, you know, it's pretty much bread and butter on DK, so very strong. Now our fifth ability here is Harness Magicka. Now the reason that we do this is for a couple of reasons. I first want to touch on the one that you may be thinking, and you may be thinking, why do you not running Absorb Magic? And just to familiarise you all with that, Absorb Magic is this ability here, Defensive Posture Unmorphed, and basically when it's slotted, the main thing to keep in mind is when it's slotted, it reduces the amount of damage that, it increases the amount of damage you can block by 8%, and reduces the cost of blocking by 8%. This makes it quite powerful. However, I'm opted not to use it on this build, primarily because instead of just using stamina to block, we're also using Magicka, meaning that the cost reduction just into just into stamina, isn't actually that relevant as it is in a purely stamina tank, and I actually find it much more beneficial to use a self-shield, and this is where the second reason comes in. The self-shield is really strong because it allows us to use our self-heals to heal ourselves back up if we take a big hit. By popping a Harness Magicka, our heals do get to work, where otherwise they might not be able to keep up with the damage incoming. It also makes us more independent from our healer, so let's just say our healer is a little bit weaker in a random dungeon, we can rely more on ourselves and be more self-sufficient, which in turn just makes you a better tank, assuming of course that you're not sacrificing all of your group utility, which this build certainly doesn't. In terms of our ultimate here on the front bar, it's Aggressive Horn, and this is strong, not only what I touched on earlier, the actually adding the 10% stats, our max Magicka, our health and our stamina, but also nice because it allows our DPS to get major force, and even though this was slightly nerfed with the patch, it's still a very strong buff, and worthwhile keeping up as much as possible. Now, one thing I will say is, before I show you some footage of how this actually works out, you have an idea of how to actually play this in terms of a rotation. Aggressive Horn and the build we're using, the idea is to try and keep up the max stats pretty much 100% uptime by ourselves. This is why when we are fighting single target, as I said before, but just to reiterate it, we're going to go to our Bloodspawn set and slot this, and use this when we're fighting single target. With this ultimate regen added on top of our Werewolf, added on top of Heroic Slash, on top of our Swallow Soul, getting 2 ultimate every 4 seconds, and in addition to the class passive here, which when we pop a pot gives 20 ultimate, means that we can, with a little bit of RNG on our side, pretty consistently keep up the stat benefit of Warhorn by ourselves, which is really solid for not only us but our group. In addition to all of that, we can also get Major Heroism, which is kind of a hidden buff, so to speak, but basically this is activated when we're blocking and taking damage. It's going to activate then, and also can be activated by light attacking the boss, because sometimes the boss won't attack enough, or at least not frequently enough, to keep the ultimate regeneration constantly ticking, so we might lose out on some ultimate, so keep that in mind as well. So now that you've listened to how the front bar plays out, let's show it in action just so you get a better understanding of how to play the build. So as we go in, it's important to first get taunt and then apply our sort of ultimate regeneration tools instantly to try and keep the uptime as much as possible. So as we go in, we can go ahead and taunt the boss, apply this, go ahead and apply our Swallow Soul and a Refreshing Path and pop Warhorn. Pop our pot as well once we pop our Warhorn to get that 20 ultimate instantly ticking over to allow us to cast our new ultimate when it does come available. Now if we take damage like now, we can always pop this as well, go for a heavy attack for example if we're low, as popping a self shield is really useful, especially if we're to take damage such as now to really maintain our stats. In addition, Harness Magicka is going to be constantly pretty much restoring resources to us, because part of that tooltip is the fact that when we take damage, assuming that it is the applicable damage type, it's going to be restoring Magicka to us, so it is quite efficient from a resource management point of view. May pop another Warhorn, and there we go. So I did not necessarily do this perfectly, but you get the idea of how we're going to be rotating. avoiding any sort of chronos, popping any abilities that we need to. Though you will see right now that our resources are getting a little bit stressed, and you're thinking, well, there must be a little bit of a problem here, right? So, you'd be right. And the reason behind that is because we're not using another key ability in the Nightblade repertoire. So let's get into that quickly, and I'll show you what our rotation looks like with that, as it is the one I'm more familiar with. We just wait for this boss to reset, so that we can successfully look at that very quickly. As I don't want to dwell on it too much, I just want to very briefly introduce the skill. And unfortunately this boss refuses to de-aggro, so let's run away. So now that the boss is de-aggroed, basically what we want to do is just very quickly have a look at this ability here on the back bar, which is Siphoning Strikes. And this ability is great because we can utilize a tactic which involves light animation cancelling to get our sort of 1090 per light attack very quickly on both Magicka and Stamina, meaning that we can sustain our resources effectively. Now, for those of you that maybe even notice my stats are a bit weird right now, that is because I accidentally slotted a medium armor Bloodspawn piece rather than the light, which means even I can make this mistake, so be careful with that. Anyways, so we're just going to focus on this, as we don't want to sort of complicate it, but basically if we go into a fight, we're going to activate this, we're going to go in, and we're just going to rinse the same process, but instead you can see how I'm leaving light attacks very quickly, to make sure that our resources are maintained, and allows us to spam abilities very well. So now we can pop this to swap bars to do it efficiently, pop it again, and go back to light attacking to our heart's content. And you'll see here, we just pop Warhorn, you'll see right now that our resources are very much, sustained. So, just to very briefly show you how to do that, as obviously doing all the abilities might have missed it. If we just left click, and this is default binds, left click and then block instantly, you see here, how I'm light attacking very quickly, and it's blocking it, and also, by animation cancelling this, it means our block is maintained, very substantially. So let's just, I guess, waste all of our Magicka pool, and I'll just show you how quickly you can get this back up. Just very quickly do this, go to our back bar, and then we'll just pretend that my ping didn't spike to 999 and completely ruin what I was trying to show you, and that we're just about to do the exact same thing that you saw in the last clip. Anyways, as you see here, our Magicka is very low, but just by doing this, left click block to animation cancel, we're restoring our resources very quickly, at least at a much higher rate than, you would have with a high Magicka recovery. So a very efficient way to do it. It's also beneficial as well, because since we're, animation cancelling, it means that our block is maintained, which in turn means that you're less liable to get hit by a heavy attack, and if you don't block those, you can get one-shot sometimes, so it just makes it a whole lot safer to do. I also just want to reiterate that when you are bar swapping, because you see here your block drops, it's really nice to do this, pop Harness Magicka and then block, so that, for example, we just wait for the boss to hit us. If we do this, and then bar swap when he hits us, it means that we're going to take less damage, especially irrelevant on our charged back bar, because we don't have as much, resistance as we see here. Our resistance has dropped quite significantly. Anyways, that's about it for the front bar, guys. And as you saw there, you see that the actual, the Warhorn uptime on our stat buff, while not being 100%, was certainly quite solid, and up in the high sort of percentages to make it quite useful, especially in a group where Warhorn isn't being run by anyone else but yourself. Let's now get into the most exciting part of the build, which is the Ice Staff component. So before we do discuss the skills themselves, let's quickly look at the new passive changes. So in Try Focus, we see that a fully charged Frost Heavy attack is going to taunt the enemy that it hits for 15 seconds and also grant a small damage shield to you. In addition to that, when we have our Frost Staff equipped, blocking is going to cost Magicka, which means that we're no longer using our stamina pool for actually blocking. There's also a few other changes as we go down. So most importantly, we see that now here in Ancient Knowledge, that when we're using a Frost Staff, it reduces the cost of blocking by 30% and increases the amount of damage you can block by 20%. So that's another sort of benefit to using a Frost Staff, in that we actually do have inbuilt kind of reductions to the amount of Magicka we're using when we block, and also the damage we're taking. Moving on from that, I want to very briefly say at the start, the first ability we're using is Inner Rage, and you'll think this a bit weird perhaps since it is a ranged taunt, but we already have one right with Try Focus. Well, unfortunately, my opinion of this is it's not really a reliable option to use. Most of the time when you are using it, you don't have time to be able to cast that long, duration heavy attack, meaning you might get interrupted, you might get knocked down or killed. So in my experience, you can make use of Try Focus, using the heavy attack to taunt, but it's only sporadically and only in certain scenarios where you know for a fact that it's safe to do so. One advantage that you can do is to initiate the fight with a heavy attack, meaning you can get taunt and perhaps a ranged add to help with pulling in with Swarm Mothers, but other than that, really, if you want to reliably taunt, Inner Rage is the best option to do so, and is pretty much a bread and butter with any other tanking class, so we should be pretty familiar with that. As we move on to our next ability, it's also important to remind ourselves that Chilled was changed so that it now applies Minor Maim to enemies, reducing their damage down by 15%. Now, prior to the Ice Staff changes, this meant that really only DKs had access to a reliable way to AoE minor maim apply to, multiple adds in a trash fights, for example. But if we're using something like Frost Pulsar, we can now do this pretty reliably, especially with a charge trait. And on top of that, not only does that allow us to, add a little bit more damage to AoEing down, but a 10% debuff to their HP means that they're going to die a lot faster, at least if they're, actually liable to that buff, because not all adds are liable to that debuff of 10% minor mango. Sap Essence is the next ability on our bar, and this is solid first off because it allows us to add a little bit more damage into trash fights, but also simultaneously heals our group and can scale to be quite a large heal, as you see, it increases by 20% more for each enemy hit. In addition to that, you also get a nice buff uptime on Major Brutality and Major Sorcery, which, especially with Major Sorcery, some abilities are going to scale quite well, such as some of our heals, in addition to also just enabling the effectiveness of Frost Pulsar and a few of other Frost abilities to do quite a little bit more, and in turn mean that enemies are dying faster, and there's less room for kind of error, less room for enemies doing damage to our team, which could be detrimental if DPS was low. The next ability we're going to talk about is Blockade of Frost, and this is actually one of the most crucial abilities that we want to use on our Frost Staff, and it kind of provides, with quotation marks, using those, finger up and down quotation marks, basically it provides the Talons effect for non-DKs. So once we do chill the enemy, and we're using chill, the charge trait, we're using multiple ways of applying frost damage, it's going to happen really frequently. When they get chilled, they become immobilized, and as long as we keep this ability down on the ground, it's going to effectively immobilize all of the enemies that are chilled, which means that we can effectively Talons them in place and AoE them down, and in my opinion is really quite useful and enjoyable, especially when paired with Soul Mothers, because honestly the trash fight management is amazing, at least for me. Soul Mothers was the first part they added in, and then when they added this change in, it just made the ad management that bit better, and for me makes playing Magicka Nightblade tanking in trash fights more enjoyable than it used to be. As before, for example, in the clip I showed you before, sometimes enemies would keep on running back out of the stack. This here ensures that they stay in the stack, meaning that Soul Mothers is a little bit more effective as well, and you're not constantly pulling them back in, which, might involve them running out of ground dots and just being a less effective kind of AoE burn than it could be. However, it's important to keep in mind that since it does do cold damage, there is this small chance that you might actually chill the enemy when you apply this, and if they are outside of the stack, they could get immobilized. This means that Soul Mothers won't drag them in, especially relevant for melee adds, which in turn could decrease the effectiveness. So this is kind of a downside, but as long as you're mindful, it shouldn't be too much of an issue whatsoever. The final ability, surprise surprise, is Siphoning Attacks. Great ability because it allows us to restore resources with light attacks really efficiently, especially with that technique I showed you of animation cancelling your light attacks. But in addition to that, you also have a 10% chance on direct damage abilities to get back extra, Magicka and stamina. Now just to show you, because I didn't actually show you at the time, you can do this in your Ice Staff as well, and it's not quite as efficient, not quite as quick, but you can certainly do it the same while keeping block up a relatively high amount at the time, so just keep that in mind. Now, before moving on to the ultimate ability, one last thing I want to say about the Ice Staff sort of chilled interaction. Now, unless they've changed it kind of under the cover or I've just missed it, the last sort of notice which was made about the proc chance of chilled, like this chance in each ability, is as follows. So on our AoE sort of single target, so to speak, there's no kind of dot component to this, there's a 5% chance to apply chilled. And obviously with charged, we're increasing that by 220%, and with elemental force by 100%. Likewise, with Blockade of Frost, there was a 1% chance with area of effect damage over time abilities, which means that here, Blockade of Frost isn't going to be proccing it that, too much. It's a very low chance, but we are boosting it up with Charged and Elemental Force, which makes it a little bit higher than usual. In addition to that, we're using Ice Comet to just further provide another way of providing extra damage, which in turn, cold damage primarily, which in turn means that Chilled can proc much more often. Now, because we've orientated our whole build around high ultimate regeneration, this means that we can cast this ability quite frequently, which in turn allows us to actually use Ice Comet on trash fights relatively frequently, while also ensuring that we have a Warhorn ready for the boss fights. In that sense, you kind of have to get a feel for it, kind of see, how much ultimate am I getting. So I would say kind of be a little bit, I guess, more careful when you first start, but when you get more comfortable with casting Ice Comets, feel free to do so when you get to that happy point of having, your Warhorn ready, even though you are using ultimates like this. Now, if you didn't want to run this, you might be thinking to yourself, isn't Veil of Blades just better, for example? Or perhaps even Elemental Storm? Now, I don't like Elemental Storm because it provides a very comparable effect, but the ultimate cost is too high in my opinion. But the comparison to Veil of Blades is quite relevant because it's the same ultimate cost. So, what's to be said about this? Well, this provides major protection to our allies, so if they do stand in it, it's going to reduce their damage taken by 30%. In comparison to this, you think, oh, well, there's no damage component reduction-wise, but actually because Chill does apply minor maim, this in a sense does guarantee, so to speak, because of the amount of ticks this adds and, amount of extra cold damage it adds, does sort of guarantee the fact that the enemy's going to have minor mem applied to them, or at least, it's very likely that they will. In addition to that, this means that not only are allies going to be taking 15% less damage, but also they don't have to stand within some kind of, in this case, a 5 meter radius. They can sort of stand outside as well, which is a little bit more utility there. Now, in terms of the radius, they're both the same radius as well, in terms of the dot that's left over from Ice Comet, so the stacking kind of area for you to work on is still the same, so not much difference. The damage itself here works out better as well. You're doing much more damage with Ice Comet than you are with Veil of Blade, so you get more bang for your buck in that respect. And you also get a nice knockback, which kind of interrupts the enemies. One thing I will say is that the knockback doesn't actually knock them that far out, so it's not actually going to interrupt with a stack. It's not going to just smash them out of your stack and ruin everything, which is what I was a little bit worried about from testing it. They tend to just get knocked up in the air rather than getting knocked back, and the stun for 2 seconds does alleviate any kind of burst DPS that might happen if you don't have all the enemies aggroed on you, or perhaps you missed a sword on board or a two-hander, which might save someone's life. In addition to that, it's going to snare them by 50% movement speed-wise, and is very comparable to the 70%. So really, in my opinion, Ice Comet is just simply better in pretty much every regard. Though might be a little bit of a weird choice for those of you, seeing this as tanks don't often slot abilities like this. In terms of stat benefits, I'll say, naturally, if you're going to be running Veil of Blades, you'd be increasing, you'd be getting a little bit more max health, and yeah, that's pretty much it. You're getting 3% extra max health. In comparison to that, if we're doing the Mage's Guild, and we're slotting this, we're going to be getting 2% extra max Magicka and Magicka recovery, in addition to having some kind of like empower mechanic, which could be useful, but it's primarily this. So it's a question, do we want 3% more health, or 2% extra Magicka, max Magicka and recovery? In my opinion, this is also stronger. On the note of that, actually, it also reminds me, with Fighter's Guild, make sure you get Banish the Wicked. It's some extra ultimate when we kill undead Daedra or werewolves, and even though we're not using any abilities in the Fighter's Guild, another really solid ability to get. So with all that covered, let's now get into some gameplay, and I'm going to showcase both how it looks like when we're not using our Ice Comet ultimate in comparison to how we are using the Ice Comet, and a few other, I guess, sort of tips that I'll raise. One thing I will say as well is when you're watching this, I obviously haven't had perhaps enough time to completely 100% determine if charged is the best, but if you yourself find that you're applying, chilled and immobilizing enemies enough without charged, defending would be the other trait that you probably want to consider using on your Dragon Ice Staff backbar, though charged is really the sort of way to entirely ensure that you're pretty much always guaranteeing chilled being applied, which is nice from a reliability standpoint. So here we are now to kind of showcase how it looks like in action, and we're back to the beloved trash pull that I always seem to use in my videos. So because we are using a charged backbar, it's important to first precast Refreshing Path to get our defensive buff, in addition to perhaps using a Harness Magicka. Now basically what we want to be doing is we're just going to run into it, and also we want to be applying our Siphoning attacks to get our stats back when we are doing damage, as we are going to get our Magic recovery set to 0 and be using Magicka when we are blocking on our Ice Staff. So we go in, we apply this buff, perhaps use a Soul Stone to get some health back, and then we do this, we put this on the ground, and now we start to apply Pulsar to the enemy, and as you see here, they're all getting snared quite consistently. So yeah, quite an efficient way to do about it, and they're all kind of locked in place. So you get the idea, and even though some of them occasionally were not reduced, I'm just dying here by the way to show you the ultimate difference with Ice Comet, even though some of them weren't snared, basically, at least, 5 out of 6 were at any one time, meaning it's actually quite efficient and quite a high sort of proc chance, which is counter to what many people were saying. Many people believed it would be quite inefficient. So, with that in mind, let's now go into it with the with Ice Comet. Another thing also to remember is that, in this situation we have all the enemies hitting us. When we are doing this with 4-man content, they're not always going to be hitting us, which in turn means our magic is not going to be going down quite as quickly. And if I was perhaps in an environment where I could drop block a bit more because, my healer is there, I would be dropping block, allowing my magic recovery to actually be active, and, perhaps using this to heal myself, in addition to also light weaving a bit more. But since we are kind of a healer, I'm doing this just to be a little bit more tanky and not die straight away so I can demonstrate the points. So don't be alarmed by that. And I'll try and do it this time for you here because we're using Ice Comet. So, once again, pop our resistance buff. We run in, we swap to this bar, and we use Ice Comet on the middle here. And you see how they're getting hit up. And they're all getting snared in place. And here, if we want to heal ourselves, we can do that. And we're probably going to die here, but oh no, I think we're going to be fine, but you get the idea. If we had a healer, it would be much more efficient. And if I was swapping bars to reapply this and this, then dying wouldn't really be an issue whatsoever. But as you saw there, they were all held in place, no enemies really ran outside, and it worked efficiently. So, and as you'll see here, my ultimate is now back to, the 170 mark, which means that, well, we're ready to cast another Ice Comet, and we're not very far away from casting a Warhorn. So what I've got here is just one last trash fight, which is kind of, I guess, pull it all together and show you that also that patience can be important, trying to wait until you actually drag everything in. At the start of this fight, I actually do, as I said before, to be careful with, use Elemental Blockade, and it actually does, unfortunately, proc on one of the individuals at the back there, and Sniz has been that melee there guy, and he's not, able to reach the stack. What I do now here is just ensure I'm healing myself, Sap Essence, and drop Meteor when they're all nice and stacked. And as you'll see, they're all getting snared nicely and pretty much as intended. Now, well, this time certainly, we demonstrated that this build can successfully heal itself quite effectively, but also doing AoE damage. If we do want to do a lot of frost damage and ensure that enemies are snared in place, this does come at the expense of our self-heals, which in turn means that, occasionally our health is going to dip down to the 50% mark without a healer. But once again, this is for group content. In addition to that, keep in mind that this was, I guess, for better or for worse, a trash pack that does drop things like standards and other AoEs, meaning that there's quite a lot of damage going around. I feel like I should also mention that, as you notice here, the boss is just ahead. So if you are fighting a trash pack that is just before a boss, I wouldn't recommend using your ultimate, as you won't have quite enough for a Warhorn. Finally, we've got to the part where we talk about a few other aspects that I have, just left to the end, I suppose, because it made more sense than to do it kind of jumbled in with the rest of the info, just to keep it a little bit more clear, I guess. And we also need to cover the CP point allocation. So, in terms of some aspects we haven't talked about, obviously food and potion use has not been discussed. In terms of potions, I would recommend using tripods primarily. It's probably the best option now, since other options like vitality potions have been nerfed with the Homestead patch. This is great because it provides us with a little bit of healing and also magic and stamina, which we use simultaneously for blocking. So, Solidaire and also the recovery, depending on what bar we're on, is going to allow us to retain the respective stat. In terms of food, Tri-Stat can't be beaten. Same reason that we actually do 5 heavy, 1 light, and 1 medium armor pieces to try and get as much raw stats as we can, as it scales well with being a tank. Moving on from that, let's get into the CP tree discussion. Now in the blue tree, what I've opted for here is a mix of damage, because it scales well not only with AoEing down adds effectively, but also some of our healing abilities are also related to damage. In a similar vein, because we do a lot of healing, we also want to put a lot of points into Blessed to try and increase our healing as much as possible. And with Elfborn, just a little bit of extra healing and damage from our spells in a similar vein to both Elemental Expert and Blessed. So pretty simple here. In terms of useful things that we unlock, spell precision is nice, and the extra spell critical is certainly helpful. And occasionally, when we do kill an enemy, we're going to be able to allow ourselves to actually restore some Magicka to our allies. And since we are doing a lot of AoE damage, this can happen quite consistently in trash pack environments. Moving on from this tree, let's now go into the orange tree, or the brown tree, dependent, I guess. So here, we allocate a lot of points into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now, in a general sense, my guide would be this. Depending on what your resistances are, and because I'm bred to my spell resistance higher, I opt to allocate more points into Hardy. Now, this is obviously going to change by person to person, but you just want to kind of mix, depending on what damage you're taking, and the general guide is that. Now, if you are taking more, for example, physical damage, for a fact, then obviously you want to reallocate this into Hardy, and conversely, if you know for a fact you're taking more spell damage, you want to allocate more points into Elemental Defender. Pretty simple there, and I like these better than some of the other options, such as, going for Spell Shield or something like that, as I don't think they're as efficient as these two options here. In addition to that, we also unlock the Shield Expert. It's probably one of the most important ones, as increasing the armor of our shields by 75% means that the reinforced trait on our shield really does get extra value. In addition to that, Unchained is quite nice. It's reducing the stamina cost of our next ability by 80%, but it was nerfed with the Homestead patch, meaning it's no longer quite as overpowered, I guess, if you accidentally got stunned. And I say accidentally because sometimes it actually was, I guess, quite useful to get stunned if it was not going to kill you, something that was fine, and you could actually get a lot of abilities off, so they've just reduced it to 1 stamina cost ability, getting reduced by 80%. The other points I like to allocate into Quick Recovery. This just means that the healing that we're doing to ourselves and also the healing from healers hits a little bit harder, so it just makes us a bit more tanky. In terms of the green tree, and unfortunately this is actually blocking it, I have no idea why, to be honest, why it's doing that. I actually don't know if it originally did that. No, look, it's just a bug. Fixed it. Sorry about that, I only realised it was doing that now. So going to the green tree, in terms of what would go here, I put a lot of points into Magician because a lot of our abilities are Magicka based and I want to reduce the cost of it. Now because we are blocking a lot on both our Ice Staff and our Sword and Board, I've allocated a little bit less into Arcanist because sometimes our Magicka recovery simply won't be active, and then, actually put then more points into Magician. I've also allocated a few points into reduction of our stamina, as since our stamina obviously is a little bit better than our previous build, my Azure tank build, it certainly isn't the level where we can, get away with having some reduction into stamina. So that's pretty much the justification behind that. Anyways, guys, that's it with CP. Obviously, I'm not 600 CP yet, but in terms of allocating those points, it'll be more into resistances, more into some cost reduction, and more into some extra damage or healing, depending on your tastes. A few other things that I haven't mentioned yet is a Mundus choice. So for this, I recommend going with the Atronach. What does this do? Well, it's going to be boosting our Magicka recovery, which is really nice when we're on our sword and board or not blocking on our ice staff. Another sort of thing to keep in mind, when we are blocking on our ice staff, when we do CC break, if we get stunned, it's actually going to take the resource used to do that out of the stamina pool and not the Magicka pool, meaning that actually CC breaking if you get stunned is quite efficient in that if we are on our sort of, I guess, ice staff and we're running around not really blocking, if we get stunned, we don't have to use our Magicka to get out of that stun, so it doesn't impact our Magicka resources too much, which is an added benefit, I guess, of getting to use Magicka for tanking. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that many tanks will recommend going into the shadow tray here and using Shadow Ward to get your block reduction. Now, because we're using Sturdy on all of our armor pieces, and because we're using 3 shield enchantments in our jewelry, basically it's not really needed in my opinion. And keep in mind as well that Shadow Ward and Sturdy, there's diminishing returns interaction there, they're multiplicative, meaning that you really want to go with one or the other. So if you do prefer to perhaps, not use Sturdy in your armor, then I recommend, going to Shadow Ward, but if you want to follow my guide to the letter, so to speak, don't put any points into Shadow Ward as it's not needed. Finally, I want to just talk about the racials. So for best racial wise for this build, I've went ahead and gone Breton. Is Breton the best? Well, the cost reduction is nice, the max magic is nice, and so is the spell resist. However, in terms of what would be absolutely best for this, the racials I would recommend would be Argonian, Imperial, and I guess Breton, only because I like it myself. The reason that Argonian is strong is because it's going to provide us some tripod effects on our pots. We get extra resources from our pots, which helps on our Nightblade's resource maintenance. You also get a max Magicka and max health buffs, alongside getting some extra healing done and received, which helps with and synergizes well with some of our healing abilities like Sap Essence, Refreshing Path, and Swallow Soul. Now, the reason I say Imperial is strong as well is because Imperial has such insane stat values. I believe they get, I think it's 23%, I think it's a 10% stamina buff and maybe like a 13 to 14% health buff roughly. And this means that it's the most sort of raw stats in the game. And in addition to that, they have, I think it's Red Diamond, when you light attack or do any melee attack, there's a 10% chance of getting health back. And when we're doing that animation cancelling effect, you can understand how that would actually proc quite a lot and give us a nice heal. Now, even though it doesn't give us Magicka, the fact that it gets so many stats in terms of stamina and health means we can actually allocate more points into Magicka, with the resulting factor be that we'd have very comparable stats to this, with the upside of probably having a bit more health and stamina. So yeah, thanks for watching through if you've made it this far. Pretty much that's the whole comprehensive guide for this tank. And if you did enjoy it, please let me know. And if you need any help, likewise, don't feel afraid to ask. So until next time, guys, bye for now.